I don't believe God exists, but not just any God. Your gods. Hi, my name is Fuad and welcome to Philosophy, where we discuss hot takes on analytical philosophy of religion, history, music, and pop cultures. In this video, I'm going to explain to you in depth what is agnosticism, why it's an often misunderstood position, why am I an agnostic, and what does it take for me to change my position. As always, the caveats are, this video is a deep philosophical discussion intended for philosophical elaboration. This is in no way an effort to debunk religion and or scrutinize theism. I'm not a professional philosopher, only a so-called internet philosopher. So please take this video with a grain of salt. And as always, the script for this video is available on my Patreon. So yeah, let's get philosophical. Agnosticism is simply a view of not knowing whether God exists or not. It is a position taken on epistemic grounds. According to my friend and fellow philosopher Joe from Majesty of Reason, there are 4 types of agnosticism. There are epistemic agnostic, suspension agnostic, pure agnostic, and literal agnostic. The epistemic agnostic is a person who thinks it's possible to know God, but after assessing the evidences concerning God, they find out that the evidences are evenly weighed. The strength of the argument that proves the existence of God is evenly matched against the counter-arguments or the arguments that propose otherwise. Out of all the types of agnostic, this is probably the most active one in discussing God. The suspension agnostic is similar to the epistemic, in which they probably already weigh the evidences. But they stop with the conclusion of it as being inconclusive. So rather than actively trying to find another evidences or counter-evidences, they stop altogether with the inconclusiveness. Now, this might come out as rather lazy if you think about it, but not all people have much time in their hands like me to be spent for the sake of finding God, you know? So rather than making some faith-based conclusion about the existence of God, they just and be on with their lives. Pure agnostic. This is the kind of agnostic that either too diligent or too lazy. This one is the type of dude who claim that God is impossible to know by definition. The last one is literal agnostic, such as a little baby who doesn't have the capacity to comprehend and compare evidences, or some secluded tribe who never hear anything about the concept of God at all. Now, the question is, what kind of agnostic I am? Well, to put it simply, I consider myself as suspension agnostic. After carefully examining most kind of God's arguments, most types of theism, and many doctrines from many religion, and after comparing them with atheistic approaches, while also being cognizant with our epistemological limitation, I can safely say that all the data point out to be inconclusive. I don't know whether God exists or not, and don't think that we as humans can know. I'm not going to elaborate much further the arguments here, however, as most of my videos in this channel already do that. So if you're interested in challenging me, you can watch my other videos first. Anyway, my agnosticism is not written in stone though. I'm willing to change my position according to my own understanding and circumstances. I also always willing to swing my position towards either atheism or theism. Although, truth be told, I don't know what can convince me to swing either way. However, what is very unlikely is me adopting your religions. Because despite being an agnostic, I'm 99.99% convinced that your God does not exist. Now that's a claim. I consider myself as a philosophically informed agnostic, which means that my agnosticism is mainly reinforced by philosophical arguments of God, be it for or against. So here's the thing, I didn't become an agnostic from theistic position. In fact, I became an agnostic after becoming an atheist for around 3 years. When I became an agnostic, I already don't believe in God. At the time, I was influenced by New Atheism and their figures, to which I adopted their scientism and a naturalistic approach towards reality. But when I encountered analytic philosophy of religion and philosophy of science somewhere in late 2022, I became aware that despite incredibly advanced and competent, our scientific approach towards reality are still imperfect. The fact that we change our science when new evidence is presented is its own proof. The other thing that I realized is, as long as science are being operated by human, which is by their nature fallible, science will also fallible. Sure, science could answer and make a prediction about what there is, but the extent of their ability only limited to our own local universe. At least nowadays, there is no way for us to know what lies beyond our universe. It could be everything. It could even be the supernatural. Such philosophical evaluation finally made me ditch my hard naturalism and opted for a more skeptical naturalism, where I claim that our local universe is natural while making no claim about everything outside it. Now, it's need to be understood, me ditching a scientific worldview is not equivalent of me ditching science altogether. I still think that science and the scientific methods are the best way to render truth about our world and reality. The key takeaway here is science is the best way, not the only way. I certainly think we should take into account non-scientific approach such as philosophical inference and testimonial evidence to the varying degree of reliability. I'm not an agnostic because of science. I'm an agnostic because of philosophy. Science and agnosticism is the same result I got because doing philosophy. While science keeps reassuring me in my philosophical stance towards reality, it's rarely, if never, do anything about the metaphysics. The other thing that you also need to understand is, me ditching hard atheism does not make me become more lenient toward theism. On the contrary, I became much more unconvinced that your God exists. I think the definition of agnosticism is a very simple, clean-cut definition. To say that you don't know whether God exists or not is very self-explanatory. It's like saying whether I know or not that there is a horse doing backflip in one of the planets in Andromeda Galaxy. None of us, of course, have the capacity to know that. The best we can do is make hypothetical guesses based on our reasonings. But despite being easy, agnosticism often being poorly misunderstood and, more often than not, labeled negatively as cowardly. The first misunderstanding is thinking that agnosticism is taken on belief, which is, of course, not. People keep equating belief and knowledge within the same category. Again, while theism is taken on belief, agnosticism is taken on knowledge. Belief does not require knowledge to validate. You can completely believe in God without having any knowledge that warrants its existence. On the other hand, agnosticism does not even talk about belief. It lacks belief, so to speak. To come back with my analogy, of course you can just believe that there is a horse doing backflip in Andromeda Galaxy with or without any reasons behind it. The second misunderstanding is people keep thinking that agnosticism is an intermediary position between theism and atheism. Again, it's not. If you want to know my reasoning, you can go ask the backflip horse in one of the Andromeda planet. Or you can look at this awesome toggle switch that I made. There are theists who believe that there is a God, atheists who has no belief that there is a God, Gnostic who have knowledge that there is a God, agnostic who have no knowledge that there is a God. This graph accurately shows one thing clearly, that while there is an overlap between theism and agnosticism, those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can be a Gnostic theist who have belief that God exists and have knowledge about it. Think of people like theologian and apologetics who believe in God and can back the claims with proofs. An agnostic theist who have belief that God exists but have no knowledge about it. Think of lay people who believe in God but cannot provide you with the proofs. Now, I'm not saying that this kind of people is stupid, but normatively speaking, since God belief is almost always doctrinally pre-installed within our worldview from literally when we are a little kid, most of us just grow up believing that without bother looking for the evidences. A Gnostic atheist who don't have full belief that God exists and have knowledge about it. Think of the new atheists and those who adhere to radical scientism. They claim to have proof that God doesn't exist through mainly scientific methods. An agnostic atheist who don't have belief that God exists but have no knowledge about it. Think of me and also lay people who were raised without their parents and their social circles ever discuss this kind of things to them. Now, these elaborations not necessarily representative, let alone accurate. It's meant to give you a clear picture of what I meant when I talk about agnosticism in that sense. But what I can clearly say is, theism is a very vast landscape consisting of belief and knowledge propositions and vice versa. I don't think simple label could clearly represent someone. The best thing you can do is have a discussion with them, if you really want to know their position about their theistic inclinations. Now, the reasons why such misunderstanding kept on happening could be because of many things. But here, I'd like to give 3 dialectically motivated reasons as why such misunderstanding commonly occurs. The first one is the equivocation of belief with believe. First of all, belief is a noun. It refers to conviction or acceptance, often related to faith, trust, or a strong opinion, while believe is a verb, meaning to accept something as true or real. While both positions could be taken regardless of proof or evidence, the implication of such word is very different. In the context of the definition, I use belief consistently as a noun similar with knowledge. Believing in God is an action taken on conviction. It's an active participation based on something more fundamental. On the other hand, have belief in God makes the belief itself as the fundamental. The second reason is we never really have a clear definition of what God we are talking about, which we are going to talk about later. Lastly, agnostics are often being perceived as cowardly and inconsistent. You see, there is an impression within the Abrahamic culture that equates religious belief with convictions, something that not only you have to take, but also defend. I think it's normal, since Abrahamics were born from a very hostile geographical surroundings. Therefore, your religion is not only about your relationship with God, but also your tribal identifier in a world where tribal wars are the norm. Anyway, this equivocation is apparently theologically codified with draconic law system. If you disbelieve, you are labeled with everything bad, threatened with severe punishment by God, or sentenced to death by some peaceful religion's law. That said, there seemed to be an impression that those who became an agnostic kind of wager their faith. They don't seem to believe in the God, but they don't want to be punished by that God just in case. That's why I kind of like the Eastern religion more. They born out of fertile land. Their gods usually are not as jealous and vindictive as their Western counterparts. Therefore, their religion is much tamer in comparison. The second example is, within the theistic-atheistic debate concerning things like cosmogenesis, for example, the two camps seem to only accept only two propositions. Either universe is created by God or the universe is uncreated. I think this attitude is way too binary. I mean, what's wrong with saying that we don't know? At this point, we really don't know the truth, right? That's why the theists, mostly Abrahamics, claim that God created the universe yet decline to elaborate the method, while the scientists and philosophers still debating each other about many hypotheses concerning that. I think the fact that there are people who are unconvinced should make the theists realize that their proof for God is not strong enough to warrant belief, and also should make the atheists realize that there are still infinite frontiers yet to be discovered. Knowing every laws and forces of this universe is not enough to claim the non-existence of either God, prima causa, or whatever it is that lies beyond our understanding. Now let's get to the dilemma that kept me away from theism. I have two dilemmas specifically. Let's start with the first one. Suppose that there is a group of friends having a trip to a lake somewhere in Sumatra. One of the friends, let's call him Fuad, somehow out of the blue decided to challenge God to strike him with a thunder in the edge of the lake. He then walked away from his friend group, stand still for a moment while murmuring something akin to a prayer or invocation. He then finally shouted loudly, "God, strike me with thunder!" His bewildered friend, trying to make sense of the situation, then started to discuss what happened. The Muslim and the Christian friend tells the group that of course Fuad is punished by God for using God's name in vain. They don't agree though which God caused it, Yahweh or Allah. The Norse polytheist and the Hindu agreed that the thunder would come from the god of thunder. Only they don't agree which god caused it, Indra or Thor. The Buddhists convinced that while the thunder is natural, Fuad was stricken due to his karma. The atheists, pantheists, and the deists agreed that the thunder were a result of natural occurrence. Fuad only got lucky or extremely unlucky, depending on how you see being randomly stricken by a thunder in the middle of broad daylight is. The three of them, however, couldn't agree whether the natural world is all there is, God by definition, or only a metaphysical part of a deity. Now, the question is, which of this friend group got it right? Why and how? I call this dilemma the God of Thunder dilemma, a meta-epistemological problem about how do we know what we know about God. This is a valid dilemma, especially within our world where so many people coming from so many religions reacting to so many events and attributing those events to so many gods under so many reasons. Right now, at least as far as I'm aware, there is still no agreement about who ultimately caused everything that happened within this world. So here's the problem with that. Like it or not, religion makes a truth claim about our state of reality. In fact, religious truth claim is essential within one's belief towards that religion. In the context of the dilemma, their debate stemmed from the fact that within their belief systems, God somehow involved in the thunder. Well, except for atheists for obvious reasons. Not only those claims contradict each other, we are also currently unequipped to realistically check which God actually caused the thunder and in what way. Suppose that their universalist friend approached the friend group and say that all of their answers is both correct and wrong. They are correct in their assumption that God caused the thunder, yet wrong to be insistent that their specific God is the causer. Unbeknownst to them, they actually talk about the same God. First of all, you mean to tell me that Allah and Thor is the same God? And secondly, how do you know that they all refer to the same God? Where you got the information? And if it happens supernaturally, what kind of revelation that you received? Now, I'm not suggesting that in order to adhere to universalist approach towards religion, you should be theologically informed. I mean, it's religion. You can make shit up on the spot and claim it divinely. But the claim that Allah and Thor is the same God is a theological contradiction. And philosophically speaking, it's a metaphysical ignorance. First of all, Allah and Thor described differently within their respective source. While in Islam, Allah is understood as a monotheistic, classical theistic God, which generally understood as omniscient, omnipotent, abstract, unchanging, and eternal. In Norse polytheism, Thor is a part of a pantheon of gods with attributes similar to human, added with some superhuman attributes and relative control over natural laws. While both of them are understood as deity, their incarnation are extremely different from one another. There is no logical way that can make them one single entity without sacrificing one or their two core attributes. So, what is the solution of this dilemma? Well, I don't think there is any. I mean, if I can solve this, I wouldn't be an agnostic, would I? For one, the fact that those theists could make a similar yet contradictory claim about reality shows that at least they're in an ontological impasse. All their claims are valid yet cannot be true at the same time, nor it can be proven in any realistic way. And secondly, the fact that we cannot disprove all of them, at least within my epistemology, shows that there is still likely a chance, albeit measly, that either one of them finally proven to be true, at least sometimes in the future. So, what do I mean when I claim that, despite being an agnostic towards the existence of God, I'm 99.99% atheist towards the existence of your God? Well, that means I'm extremely convinced that neither the singular gods of the Abrahams, nor the Indian, Norse, Greek, Roman, Bataks, Egyptians, and what have you polytheists exist. There are roughly two reasons for this. One which already has been discussed at length in my previous video, the historical context. Basically, when we cross-examine religious holy books with historical data, shows that these books, and consequently the religion, changed. And not only that, even the gods are changed as well. Most of them changed based on the social, political, geographical, and climate circumstances, further signifying that the religion changed not based on something divine, but natural, according to humans' expectations at the times and circumstances. See this video to see my argument at length. The link in the description below, or maybe somewhere around these two corners. With that said, my second reason is the interpretation issues within the books, namely the epistemological and the ethical one. Nowadays, most religious people within the Abrahamic milieu have no problem interpreting Noah's flood as something allegorical or to some degree interpreting the scripture as being vague in its storytelling. This mode of interpretation, I suspect, came from the fact that by the advent of science, we come to know that no such flood ever happened in the past. Law of physics stated that such event can't happen, and or the story shown to be inspired by many older myths from cultures that precedes the scriptures. Again, with the advent of science, many now treat the stories within the holy books as either allegorical and or metaphorical and or take place in a supernatural realm. My question is this: is it always been the case that most of the stories always been interpreted that way? Mind you, scientific revolution, at least in the West, only started 500 years ago. Before that, most people knew very little about the natural world. Of course, they didn't have the methods to determine whether the Noah flood happened or not. What they know is, there is a scriptures in front of them saying that there was a flood happened. There is no passages within that scriptures that say anything about those stories meant to be interpreted allegorically. I mean, can you imagine a priest at that time telling you a biblical stories about Noah, and at the end of the session says, but you have to interpret it allegorically though? How heretical that statement would sound. And suppose that it's not heresy. By what measurement did the priest use to come into conclusion that the passages are allegorical, given the non-existence of scientific evidence? Now, the ethical part of this dilemma could get very, very ugly. Let's go to the Quran Surah Al-Mu'minun chapter 5 to 6. It states, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَى أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. Who guard their chastity except with their spouses or their slaves, with this they are not to blame. This passage, taken literally, at least legislate the Muslim two things that is considered as sinful by their modern standard: owning slave and having intercourse with their non-mahram, or that is someone of other sex that is not married to you. Now, of course, we know that we shouldn't take the verse literally, right? I mean, of course, owning slave is a sinful and deplorable behavior, let alone having sex with them. Yeah, but how do we know it? How do we know that slavery is bad? Is there any passages within the Holy Book that specifically say that? If not, then our knowledge pertaining the evil of slavery and the scientific facts for that matter were obtained elsewhere. Can you imagine how ridiculous it would sound if an ulama in the middle of Islamic Golden Age concludes that slavery is forbidden? I mean, not only there is literally no passages within the Holy Books that forbids slavery, most of great Muslim figures owned slaves. Heck, even the prophet owned slave. I think the conclusion for this dilemma could be twofold, philosophically and or theologically. Philosophically, either God omitted some obvious part within the passages that resulted in many truths become blurry, thus makes God not an all-good agent, or God forgot to include some obvious part into the passages, resulted in many truths becomes blurry, thus makes God not an omniscient agent. Theologically, God always intended for the Noah's flood to be taken literally and slavery to be regulated. If that's the case, then your adamant denial to take the flood literally and or your condemnation of slavery is an act of defiance against your God, or your holy books are simply problematic. Your renegotiation of its meaning is its own evidence. Now, the million-dollar question is, what does it take for me to believe in God? To put it simply, evidence. But what kind of evidence? Honestly, I don't really know. And ironically, I don't even think philosophical arguments would convince me, despite arguments were the very thing that made me an agnostic. You see, argument by its nature is not evidence. It only opens the probabilities whether God exists or not. And if you pay enough attention to their conclusions, most of it converges by a fact that there is something that we don't know about our reality, therefore God. Therefore Godism, as I like to say it. The other thing is, I can't merely believe for the sake of belief. First of all, I tried, and I failed. I think my mind is very analytical and scientific in nature, and I believe it's not my fault for being this way. I can freely alter my cognitive constitution the way I cannot freely change my gender. The second thing is, even if I try to believe in God by just believing, I already know that most of our propensity to believe is neurological. It's happened mainly in our prefrontal cortex, and it's already been studied immensely. So if by some miracle I found myself being overwhelmed by religious experience, my first reaction is to associate the phenomenon with my brain interacting with my immediate experience. Instead of saying that this is God doing its work, I will just say, it's just me being me. But okay, let's for the sake of argument, I'll just lay out my evidential expectations and try to be as broad as I can. Here's what I think will epistemically suffice as a benchmark of evidence for God. God has to be somehow responsible in the existence of everything. Everything has to be sufficiently explained by God. Now, how can we know that God is responsible for everything? If we study all the knowledge in relation to everything that happened in the universe, everything could be explained without presupposing God. Now, of course, we can make assumptions that everything that happens in this universe is happened because of God's involvement in one way or another. But which God caused it? Consider these statements and decide yourselves which explanation works best. The curling ball technique in football happens because a rotating ball creates a whirlpool of air with itself as its center, thus the air on one side of the ball moves in the same direction the ball is traveling in, and the air on the other side moves in the opposite direction. The curling ball technique in football happens because a rotating ball creates a whirlpool of air with itself as its center, thus the air on one side of the ball moves in the same direction the ball is traveling in, and the air on the other side moves in the opposite direction, because God Allah wills so. The curling ball technique in football happens because a rotating ball creates a whirlpool of air with itself as its center, thus the air on one side of the ball moves in the same direction the ball is traveling in, and the air on the other side moves in the opposite direction, because God Siwa wills so. The first explanation suffices perfectly, while the other two only added unnecessary explanation that contributes nothing to the main explanation. Now, it still could be the case that God is indeed involved, but until then, I think the burden of proof still rests upon the theist to decide which God that actually indeed involved. It's either one of them or none of them. So, please don't hate me. Yeah, as always, the references I have for this video are listed in the description. Thank you guys. I'll see you in the discussion hall.